Hi, everybody. I'm back, and I am here to read you the last chapter of Mary Poppins today, chapter 12, West Wind. But before I do that, I'm going to read you a new poem out of the Free to Be You and Me book. And this poem is called Don't Dress Your Cat in an Apron by Dan Greenberg. Don't dress your cat in an apron just because he's learning to bake. Don't put your horse in a nightgown just because he can't stay awake. Don't dress your snake in a muumuu just because he's off on a cruise. Don't dress your whale in galoshes if she really prefers overshoes. A person should wear what he wants to and not just what other folks say. A person should do what she likes to. A person's a person that way. And here's the picture that goes with the poem. You can wear whatever you want. That's all it's saying. You be you. All right, let's read the last chapter of Mary Poppins. I'm so excited. And then we'll talk about what our next book is going to be. Chapter 12, West Wind. It was the first day of spring. Jane and Michael knew this at once because they heard Mr. Banks singing in his bath, and there was only one day in the year when he did that. They always remembered that particular morning. For one thing, it was the first time they were allowed to come downstairs for breakfast, and for another, Mr. Banks lost his black bag. So that day began with two extraordinary happenings. "Where's my bag?" shouted Mr. Banks, turning around and around in the hall like a dog chasing his tail. And everybody else began running around too. Ellen and Mrs. Brill and the children. Even Roberts and I made a special effort and turned around twice. At last, Mr. Banks discovered the bag himself in his study, and he rushed into the hall with it, holding it aloft. "Now," he said, as though he were delivering a sermon, "my bag is always kept in one place, here, on the umbrella stand. Who put it in the study?" he roared. "You did, my dear, when you took the income tax papers out of it last night," said Mrs. Banks. Mr. Banks gave her such a hurt look that she wished she had been less tactless and said she had put it there herself. "Ugh, ugh," he said, and he blew his nose very hard, and taking his overcoat from its peg, he walked with it to the front door. "Hello," he said more cheerfully, "the parrot tulips are in bud." And he went to the garden and sniffed the air. Wind's in the west, I think. He looked toward Admiral Boom's house where the telescope weathercock swung. "I thought so," he said. "A westerly weather, bright and balmy. I won't take an overcoat." And with that, he picked up his bag and his bowler hat and hurried away to the city. "Did you hear what he said?" Michael grabbed Jane's arm. She nodded. "The wind's in the west." And she nodded slowly. Neither of them said anything more, but there was a thought in each of their minds that they wished was not there. They forgot it soon, however, for everything seemed to be as it always was, and the spring sunlight lit up the house so beautifully that nobody remembered it needed a coat of paint and new wallpaper. On the contrary, they all found themselves thinking that it was the best house on Cherry Tree Lane. But trouble began after luncheon. Jane had gone down to dig in the garden with Roberts and I. She had just sown a row of radish seeds when she heard a great commotion in the nursery, and the sound of hurrying footsteps on the stairs. Presently Michael appeared, very red in the face and panting loudly. "Look, Jane, look!" he cried, and held out his hand. And within it lay Mary Poppins' compass, with the disc frantically swinging around the arrow as it trembled in Michael's shaking hand. "The compass?" said Jane, and looked at him questioningly. And Michael suddenly burst into tears. "She gave it to me," he wept. "She said I could have it for myself now. Oh, there must be something wrong. What's going to happen? She's never given me anything before." "Well, perhaps she was only being nice," said Jane to soothe him. But in her heart, she felt as disturbed as Michael was. She knew very well that Mary Poppins never wasted time in being nice. And yet, strange to say, During that afternoon, Mary Poppins never said a cross word. Indeed, she hardly said a word at all. She seemed to be thinking very deeply, and when they asked her questions, she answered them in a faraway voice. And at last Michael could bear it no longer. "Oh, do be cross, Mary Poppins. Do be cross again. It's not like you. Oh, I feel so anxious." And indeed, his heart felt very heavy with the thought that something, he did not quite know what, was about to happen at number 17 Cherry Tree Lane. "Trouble, trouble, and it will trouble you," retorted Mary Poppins crossly in her usual voice, and immediately he felt a little better. "Perhaps it's only a feeling," he said to Jane. "Perhaps everything's all right and I'm just imagining. Don't you think so, Jane?" "Probably," said Jane slowly, but she was thinking hard and her heart felt tight in her body. The wind grew wilder towards evening and blew in little gusts about the house, and went puffing and whistling out the chimneys, slipping in through the cracks under the windows and turning the nursery carpet up at the corners. Mary Poppins gave them their supper and cleared away the things, stacking them neatly and methodically. Then she tidied up the nursery and put the kettle on the hob. "There," she said, glancing around the room to see that everything was all right. She was silent for a minute. Then she put one hand lightly on Michael's head and the other on Jane's shoulder. "Now," she said, "I am just going to take the shoes down for Roberts and I to clean. Behave yourselves, please, till I come back." And she went out and shut the door quietly behind her. Suddenly, as she went, they both felt that they must run after her, but something seemed to stop them. They remained quiet, with their elbows on the table, waiting for her to come back. Each was trying to reassure the other without saying anything. How silly we are," said Jane presently. "Everything's all right." But she knew that she said it more to comfort Michael than because she thought it was true. The nursery clock ticked loudly from the mantelpiece. The fire flickered and crackled and slowly died down. They still sat there at the table waiting. And at last Michael said uneasily, "She's been gone for a very long time, hasn't she?" The wind whistled and cried about the house as if in reply. The clock went on ticking its solemn double note. Suddenly the silence was broken by the sound of the front door shutting with a loud bang. "Michael," said Jane, starting up. "Jane," said Michael, with a white, anxious look on his face. They listened, and then they ran quickly to the window and looked out. Down below, just outside the front door, stood Mary Poppins, dressed in her coat and her hat, with her carpet bag in one hand and her umbrella in the other. The wind was blowing wildly about her, tugging at her skirt, tilting her hat rakishly to one side. But it seemed to Jane and Michael that she did not mind, for she smiled, as though she and the wind understood each other. She paused for a moment on the step and glanced back towards the front door, and then with a quick movement she opened her umbrella, though it was not raining, and thrust it over her head. The wind, with a wild cry, slipped under her umbrella, pressing it upwards as though trying to force it out of Mary Poppins' hand. But she held on tightly, and that apparently was what the wind wanted her to do. For presently it lifted the umbrella higher into the air and Mary Poppins from the ground. It carried her so lightly that her toes just grazed along the garden path, and then it lifted her over the front gate and swept her upward toward the branches of the cherry trees in the lane. "She's going, Jane! She's going!" cried Michael, weeping. "Quick!" cried Jane. "Let us get the twins. They must see the last of her." She had no doubt now, nor had Michael, that Mary Poppins had gone for good because the wind had changed. They each seized a twin and rushed back to the window. Mary Poppins was in the upper air now, floating away over the cherry trees and the roofs of the houses, holding tightly to the umbrella with one hand and to the carpet bag with another. The twins began to cry quietly. With their free hands, Jane and Michael opened the window and made one last effort to stay Mary Poppins' flight. "Mary Poppins!" they cried. "Mary Poppins, come back!" But she either did not hear or deliberately took no notice, for she went sailing on and on up into the cloudy, whistling air, till at last she was wafted away over the hill and the children could see nothing but the trees bending and moaning under the wild west wind. She did say that she would anyway. She stayed until the wind changed, said Jane, sighing and turning sadly from the window. She took John to his cot and put him into it. Michael said nothing, but as he brought Barbara back and tucked her into bed, he was sniffing uncomfortably. I wonder, said Jane, if we'll ever see her again. Suddenly they heard voices on the stairs. Children, children, Mrs. Banks was calling as she opened the door. Children, I am very cross. Mary Poppins has left us. And there's the picture of Mary Poppins going. Yes, said Jane and Michael. You knew then? Said Mrs. Banks, rather surprised. Did she tell you she was going? They shook their heads, and Mrs. Banks went on. It's outrageous. 1 minute here and then gone the next. Not even an apology. Simply said, I'm going, and off she went. Anything more preposterous, more thoughtless, more discourteous. What is it, Michael? She broke off crossly, for Michael had grasped her skirt in his hands and was shaking it. What is it, child? Did she say she'd come back? He cried, nearly knocking his mother over. Tell me, did she? You will not behave like a wild animal, Michael, she said, loosening his hold. I don't remember what she said, except that she was going. But I certainly shan't have her back if she does want to come, leaving me high and dry with nobody to help me and without a word of notice. Oh, Mother, said Jane reproachfully. You are a very cruel woman, said Michael, clenching his fist, as though at any minute he would want to hit her. Children, I'm ashamed of you, really I am. You want to back anybody who's treated your mother so badly? I'm utterly shocked. And Jane burst into tears. Mary Poppins is the only reason I want to be here, Michael wailed, and he flung himself to the floor. Really, children, really, I don't understand you. Do be good, I beg of you. There's nobody to look after you tonight. I have to go out to dinner and it's Ellen's day off. I shall have to send Mrs. Brill up. And she kissed them absent-mindedly and went away with a little anxious line on her forehead. Well, if I ever did, her going away and leaving you poor dear children in the lurch like that, said Mrs. Brill a moment later, bustling in and settling to work on them. A heart of stone, that's what that girl has, and no mistake, or my name's not Clara Brill. Always keeping herself to herself, too. Not even a lace handkerchief or a hat pin to remember her by. Get up, will you please, Master Michael? Mrs. Brill went on, panting heavily. How we stood her so long, I don't know, with her airs and her graces and all. What a lot of buttons, Miss Jane. Stand still. Do now, let me undress you. Master Michael. Plain she was, too. Nothing much to look at. Indeed, all things considered, I know that we won't be better off after all. I don't know that we won't be better off after all. Now, Miss Jane, where's your nightgown? Why, what's this under your pillow? Mrs. Brill had drawn out a small knobbly parcel. What is it? Give it to me, give it, said Jane, trembling with excitement, and she took it from Mrs. Brill's hands very quickly. Michael came and stood near her and watched her undo the string and tear away the brown paper. Mrs. Brill, without waiting to see what emerged from the package, went in to the twins. The last wrapping paper fell to the floor, and the thing that was in the parcel lay in Jane's hand. It's her picture, she said in a whisper, looking closely at it. And it was. Inside a little curly frame was a painting of Mary Poppins, and underneath was written, Mary Poppins by Bert. That's the matchman. He did it, said Michael, and took it in his hand so that he could have a better look. Jane found suddenly that there was a letter attached to the painting. She unfolded it carefully, and it ran, Dear Jane, Michael had the compass, so the picture is for you. Au revoir, Mary Poppins. She read it out loud till she came to the word she couldn't understand. Mrs. Brill, she called, what does au revoir mean? Au revoir, dearie? Shrieked Mrs. Brill from the next room. Why, what does it mean? Let me see. I'm not up on these foreign tongues. Does it mean God bless you? No, I'm wrong. I think, Miss Jane dear, it means to meet again. Jane and Michael looked at each other. Joy and understanding shone in their eyes. They knew what Mary Poppins meant. Michael gave a long sigh of relief. That's all right, he said shakily. She always does what she says she will, and he turned away. Michael, are you crying? Jane asked. He twisted his head and tried to smile at her. No, I'm not. It's only my eyes. And she pushed him gently towards his bed. And as he got in, she slipped the portrait of Mary Poppins into his hand, hurriedly in case she should regret it. You have it for tonight, darling, whispered Jane, and she tucked him in, just as Mary Poppins used to do. And there's the picture, and the compass, and the letter. The end. Ba-dum-bum. My goodness, that was such a good book. All right, our next book is going to be The Wizard of Oz. And I bet some of you have seen that movie, but I don't know if you've ever heard the book. So I hope that you will join me. All right, I will talk to you next time. Bye.